Today's Blu Ray Spot, we're having a look at the Show Factory upcoming release of Deadtime Stories on Blu Ray. This title is slated to be released on February 28th, 2017. And of course, Spot's got an early copy thanks to the folks over at Show Factory. This is a Blu-ray and DVD combo pack re-releasing Deadtime Stories, a very old movie, actually, 1986. 1986. It was one of those movies that seemed to float under radar. I wasn't even aware that this was out. Now, I'm a big fan of like the anthology series horror movies. And when I found out that Show Factory was releasing Deadtime Stories, really excited for that. The front of your case has the most terrifying nightmares now come to life. You'll pray for dawn. And a really nice looking book there with the dagger sticking in the front. Normally, when it comes to the Show Factory releases, if they re-release a movie to Blu-ray, what they tend to do is they tend to make use of the interior or the reverse insert as the means to showcase the original artwork. Now, I don't feel like this artwork here is that much different from what the original artwork was for Deadtime Stories. So instead, what they favored to do is they gave it a release or the interior insert with this ogre ghoul that ends up making an appearance in the movie. The back of the box, or the back of the case, official entry into 1986 Tokyo International Fantastic Film Festival. Your favorite nightmares come to life in a salute to the age-old bedtime story ritual. Travel on a mysterious journey to a medieval world populated by blood-crazed witches, evil experiments, and captive maidens. Then from the catacombs of dark caverns to medieval Europe, you'll plunge into modern suburbia with the adventures of a female jogger stalked by a savage werewolf. Finally, sensuality will become macabre. Black comedy as you follow the trail of three bank robbers who share their country house hideaway with a sweet murderess. Down below, special features, new high-def transfer from the original camera negative, new interviews with Melissa Leo and Scott Valentine, new audio commentary with director Jef Delman. Again, this is from 1986. Your runtime on this is 83 minutes. So it paces itself relatively well at 83 minutes. It feels like 83 minutes should fly by pretty fast. I have to admit, though, there are some aspects to this movie that I find do slow down a little bit, where I was wondering when this movie was going to finish. Down below, we've got showfactory.com as well, if you want to head over there and check out not only the really cool features that they've got, the new movies that they've got coming out now, but you can also get a slight glimpse into the future, if you will, as to future titles that are going to be coming their way to Blu-ray and DVD. Yes, this has both the Blu-ray in the 1080p high-definition widescreen and also the DVD in anamorphic widescreen. The interior, as you can see, I've already got one in the player. I've actually just watched the movie last night. I've still got the DVD here on the other side. So when you get it, it's actually going to be the Blu-ray and the DVD corresponding on either side. Okay, so basically a synopsis to this movie, and I'll try my best not to do too many spoilers for those who have not seen this. If you are a fan of, for example, the movies like basically anthology horror movies, like your Creep shows, for example. Also, Nightmares, which was a one popular one that I enjoyed as well, was Nightmares. And of course, Tales from the Crypt and Tales from the Dark Side. Tales from the Dark Side are also one of my personal favorites as well. How does Deadtime Stories fall into that category of an anthology movie series? Well, in this case, you get three movies, three individual stories played out over the course of this entire film. It's based basically around a child whose uncle, I suppose, is babysitting him for the night while the parents are out. And the child persistently wants the uncle to tell him stories. Through the first story, the child assumably falls asleep, but then wakes up, wants another story, and then again another story after that, giving us a total of 3 stories over the course of this movie. The first story has again, a medieval background to it. It tells the tale of a boy, a small teen, who actually, I think, and I didn't look at the credits yet, but I'm certain it's Nick from Family Ties who was in this movie. If you are looking for top name actors in this film, you will not find it. But the first terrifying tale is about a teenager, a boy who is basically sold into slavery, and these two sister witches basically have him doing all the dirty work for them, grabbing stuff that they need. For example, he lures one person back to their cave and or their house, and the witches proceed to dismiss and kill this one guy for things that they need for their spells. What ultimately ends up being the case is that they need to resurrect their sister, and through the stages of resurrecting the sister, the teenager boy has to go out and find a young, pretty girl to bring back and lure back to the house, where they'll use her as the sacrifice to bring the sister back to life. The first movie, the first small movie in Deadtime Stories, runs fairly well. It obviously, the overall feel for the movie, I have to sadly admit, feels like it's a very low budget that they worked with. The second of the three films seems to be my favorite, or is my favorite of the three films. The first film does feel a little on the cheap side. Not a lot of budget is spent. However, one thing that saves this first chapter is the resurrection of the sister witch. And it's a cool special effects where basically all of it is practical effects, and a lot of it is reverse cam. So things wrapping around like tendons and all the little muscle fibers and stuff to the body as she's being resurrected is basically a reverse. Instead of wrapping around her, it's coming basically off of her. They just reverse the camera. Really good practical effects in that regard. But the first film, the first story, feels a bit long. Like, it feels like it doesn't pace itself very well at all. The payoff is somewhat rewarding near the end as the more gruesome effects come to life. But even like looking at the witches, you could tell like the budget on this movie wasn't certainly high. And not even just for the first story, but the two subsequent stories as well. There's not a considerable budget in this movie. What draws me into this movie is somewhat of the cheese factor that this movie also encapsulates. It perplexes me that this uncle is telling these bedtime stories to a child I'm assuming is probably about 6 to 8. And yet the first story has to do with seduction. The witches seduce a gentleman, and the gentleman thinks that he's in a harem with these two beautiful women who proceed to be taking their clothes off. And all the while, it's these haggardy witches. Make me wonder what kind of uncle is telling tales like this to his nephew. So the first story is okay. It's not one of the best, but it's certainly not the worst of the three films. I think I can leave that title to the last story. The second story is a somewhat retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, where in this case it's more taken in the 80s. You've got this girl that is living with her grandmother, and she has to go to a pharmacy, and at the pharmacy she meets this relatively slimy, kind of leather-clad bad boy, if you will, who's also there getting his medication. Now, she ends up ultimately grabbing the wrong medication, and instead of grabbing the one for her grandmother, she ends up grabbing the one designated for this guy here. Now, of course, this is with Red Riding Hood, so I'm sure you can probably guess what kind of medication this slicked back bad boy ends up needing to sustain himself as the full light of the full moon starts cascading down to him at night. There's some transformation involved. There's some grandmother attacking involved. And needless to say, you've got Little Red Riding Hood somewhat involved near the end of the story. The story, again, is done well, but there's not a considerable budget to be had for any three of these movies. Any of these movies, you can watch it, and it doesn't quite feel like it's got the caliber of budget or acting to maybe some of the other anthology films on the market. The special effects with the transformation. And, well, we'll just get it out of the way with the wolf transformation. The wolf looks pretty good, but he also looks very much like he's got a prosthetic mask on. It's played a little bit more serious. The first one, I think, is played more serious. But then we get to the third film, or the third story. And I feel like the third story is by far the worst of the three. As you can see on the back, there is the witches from the first story. The second story having the wolf man, or the big bad wolf. The third one has to do with a family, a mother, a father, and a brother, and a young son, with the last name Bear. You can probably see where this is going. Yes, it's Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Although the only difference in this instance, instead of having animals, instead of actually having grizzly bears, what we end up getting is two psychos that break out of a mental ward, the father and the son, broken out by their mother, Mrs. Bear, and they are basically like, they are killers and they are thieves, and they go on the run from the law. What they realize they don't end up doing, or what they realize they end up doing in the process of running from the law, is that they hide out in an old house where they used to live, only now being occupied by a telepathic or telekinetic killer herself, Goldilocks. Now that sounds promising. Just by hopefully my description of it, sounds like it could be a promising final act for a 3-act movie. But unfortunately, the problem with the Goldilocks and Three Bears story is it plays solely for cheese and camp. It plays more for laughs than it plays for frights. And a lot of times I was watching the last story and thinking I was watching an episode of Benny Hill, including fast, sped up chase scenes, sped up running scenes, and then right down to the fact that even like the characters in the movie were played and their names were taken right out of storybooks. It was overall, I feel like the third one was the worst of the 3 mini stories. And again, this one, Goldilocks is showering in the bath, completely naked, and I'm asking myself this whole time, this uncle is telling this story to his nephew. Doesn't say something. I don't think I would be having my uncle over, or I would have my brother over babysitting my son, finding out these are the kind of stories that he's telling my child. The budget is extremely cheap on the last film, or the last story of Deadtime Stories. And again, of the three mini stories, the last story was the hardest, unfortunately, to watch. My overall feelings of Deadtime Stories is it's a nice outing and a nice entry if you've been collecting the anthology series of movies. I would say for a casual horror film fan, I don't know if this would necessarily be for you. For someone who's more a diehard fan that has watched the creep shows, that has watched the Tales from the Dark Sides, even have watched the likes of Nightmares, might want to give this a watch, but give it a watch knowing that it's not as good as the other ones. It doesn't have the caliber that I think the other anthology films brought to the table, and for all that reasons, I think if I had to choose of the 3 stories, the second one is the best, but it's not really by much. It's only by virtue of the fact that it had a little bit more of an interesting story, but again, the budgets and the acting really limit this movie from being in the same category as a creep show or a Tales from the Dark Side. So a casual horror film fan, maybe give it a watch. A more diehard fan could probably watch it and maybe watch it because they like the creep shows, the Tales from the Dark Sides, but it's far from being in the same league, I think, as the creep shows and those other anthology horror films. Give it a watch. It's not the greatest of movies, but at least I can say I'm glad that Shout Factory released this to Blu-ray, because one of the benefits of getting this, I didn't even know Deadtime Stories existed when I was younger. I knew of the creep shows and I knew of the other anthology films, but for some reason, I just completely lost sight that Deadtime Stories even existed. And that's one of the benefits of Shout Factory re-releasing these now to Blu-ray. It gives us a chance, like horror films like myself, horror fans like myself, gives us a chance to watch movies that maybe might have seen when you went into the VHS rental places. You might have maybe saw that in the back area and you never really thought to pick it up. It's now a good time to now be a horror fan and get these movies watching now on full 1080p Blu-ray. Again, not a great movie, but again, a really awesome release from the folks over at Shout Factory, just by virtue of the fact that I can add this now to the library along with my other favorite anthology films. Will I rewatch this one in any recent time? I watched this last night. I can't see myself watching this for probably quite some time, unless I have friends over who also are horror fans, and I can say to them, have you ever seen Deadtime Stories? And they'll say, hey, is that anything like Creepshow? And you'll just laugh and say, it's not. It's not. But let's sit down and enjoy it nonetheless. Today's Blu-ray Spot, we were having a look at the upcoming release of Deadtime Stories on Blu-ray and DVD. Again, this is going to be released on February 28th, 2017. Stay tuned, guys. Spot's going to have more videos, more Blu-ray entries coming your way as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time.